Welcome everyone to this session on youth outmigration. I'm Karen Foster. I am Associate Professor of Sociology at Dalhousie University, and I also currently hold the Canada Research Chair in Sustainable Rural Futures for Atlantic Canada. I am going to give a presentation today on the results of a knowledge synthesis project that I undertook with a PhD student, Hannah Main. And then after that, we're going to move to a presentation from Ray Bollman that looks at some of the numbers on youth outmigration. So this panel came together after a similar event last April on the same topic, where Hannah and I released this final report from a project that was funded by a SSHRC Knowledge Synthesis Grant. That stream of funding, for anybody who's not aware, is meant to support not new original empirical investigations, but projects that take stock of the existing knowledge on a topic and then synthesize it into key messages for policymakers, really. And we also hope that it's useful for scholars who are trying to situate themselves in this literature. So I applied for the grant to assess the state of knowledge on youth outmigration from shrinking communities. So the interest was in rural, but not just rural, anywhere that frets about the loss of young people. So there was a presentation in the last panel about New Brunswick. The whole province is losing population. So even in its towns and cities, this research could be applicable. In our home province of Nova Scotia, it's a perennial cause of anxiety for governments, parents, everybody really. You may have seen some paternalistic coverage of our region in Globe and Mail last year about Canada's incredible shrinking region. That's us. But shrinking populations and youth outmigration are not just an affliction of Atlantic Canada. As many of you know, these are pretty common concerns. Wherever communities are aging, losing young people, shedding employment opportunities and amenities of all kinds, youth outmigration appears as a key policy issue. Communities and their governments and subject experts believe that it demands some kind of directed policy action. But I noticed that there is, as yet, no coordinated response or even consensus about what, if anything, should be done. And so Hannah and I amassed whatever we could from the social scientific literatures that we have listed on the next slide. And we were drawing usually from the last 10 years, but drawing in some older studies if they were obviously really influential. We didn't oversample from research from or about the Atlantic region, but in our report we foreground Atlantic studies and also the Atlantic context, so we try to draw findings back to that particular region. And what we found, thankfully, was a body of literature that is in pretty profound agreement about many of the issues around youth outmigration. And if I had to summarize it in a sentence, it would be this: the attract and retain approach advocated by the Nova Scotia government and many others, and probably the wider societies that they represent, is not wrong, but it does flatten youth outmigration into an economic issue of jobs and opportunities, and it fails to recognize that jobs and opportunities are they are not decisions or factors that come up in an instant. These are things that build over many years in the course of a life. Framing the issue as an economic one around jobs, even if it's what people themselves do and they explain what their motivations are for coming or going, it fails to recognize the many other currents that are carrying, pushing, pulling, helping people away from our province and our small communities. The mainstream discussion of youth outmigration, rather ironically, also frames outmigration as a problem primarily by erasing young people's needs and interests from the conversation. So as several of the authors that we cited in our report argued in their own contexts, youth outmigration is only a problem from the perspective of the communities that are looking to hang on to population. From the perspective of young people themselves, outmigration in the moment might be the best and most beneficial choice that they can make. If we acknowledge this divergence between a community's interests and a young person's interests, then, and this is a divergence that may occasionally even present as a conflict of interests, if we take stock of the diversity of youth and the interests of both individual young people and different scales of community, then we actually come to recognize that youth outmigration is not one monolithic problem, but several different interconnected problems to solve, and therefore different solutions. So in the next slide, I want to show you a video and a website that is exemplary of the approach that's taken in Nova Scotia to give you a better sense of what our synthesis report had to respond to. So will the video work? So that video came from the kind of the aftermath of the One Nova Scotia Commission. It was part of their work following the highly influential Now or Never Nova Scotia, or the IVU report released in 2014. The report's ideas and messages have been, like I said, very influential. They've championed in the province by many people. But as far as I'm aware, there hasn't yet been a very coordinated application of the ideas around youth retention. I also did a brief scan of programs in other provinces, and I couldn't find equivalents elsewhere. So I'm really curious about campaigns and promotions that are targeted at youth retention in other parts of the province or of the country. So if people are aware of those programs in their own home provinces, I'd love to hear about them. So moving on to our findings. With that context established, with the conversation around youth outmigration depicted in that video, I'll give you a sense of some of the findings from the report. On the slide that I have there, some of those points collapse several of our findings into one. So we're kind of synthesizing the synthesis here. And if you care to read the full report, there's going to be a link to it at the end. And you would see more detail and expanded versions of all of these findings. The first point that I want to speak to is that we are not in a new or unique crisis in Nova Scotia. That's important to accept. Young people in their 20s and early 30s have always moved around a lot more than any other demographic. In the Atlantic region, we've been shedding young people since before Confederation. In rural parts of Canada and every province, the same thing tends to hold. Only the reasons and the destinations and the extent to which the loss is offset by newcomers seem to change over time. We also note, on the basis of all of the research that we synthesized, that outmigration is not a single, one-time, discrete, one-way event. Rural people move away, they move on, they hop around, and they might come back. People stay attached to varying degrees to their rural communities, even when they leave. So people come home for extended visits. There's a presentation about PEI earlier that talked about people who have summer homes, maintain summer homes on the island after they leave. And so intervening in these pathways, which are highly social and cultural and biographical, isn't straightforward. Doesn't mean it's impossible, but it's not straightforward. The second major finding is that youth outmigration from shrinking rural communities is a tricky problem because young people move for a complex mix of subjective, personal reasons and objective structural economic reasons. It represents more than just a very simple issue. So all of the literature, the thousands of surveys and interviews conducted with rural youth tells us that people don't leave or stay for jobs alone. If you ask people why did you leave or what would make you stay, they'll point to jobs first. Employment, training, and wages are certainly important factors, but the decision to migrate away from a community is made on the basis of many inputs, and it's not made in an instant. A person might move away for training for a job, but they don't wake up one day, assess their local opportunities, and say, I've got to go. Routines, cultures, values, identities, sense of place, sense of home and belonging, attachment to community and landscape, significant others, family context, school experiences, position and inclusion in peer groups and communities, academic achievement and aspirations. These are all things that emerged in the literature as factors that intersect and partially determine a young person's predilection for staying in, leaving, and or returning to their rural community. And then employment comes along and seals the deal one way or the other. So the research that we gathered is clear that people's pathways away from rural or small town life start early. They start in schools, for example, where students may hear or somehow infer that to stay rural is to fail. And it's to fail to make it in the contemporary, globally connected world. Young people who leave, in contrast to people who stay, are more likely to have parents who lived elsewhere in the past and who therefore see living somewhere else as a realistic option from day one, compared to people whose networks have always lived close by. Interestingly, young people's perceptions of available jobs and local career opportunities have been shown to be inaccurate by other studies. Some of the problem, if it is a problem, is that they are not learning early on what kinds of realistic options exist in their home communities for lifelong learning and employment. So if remember that the famous sociological dictum, the Thomas theorem, that whatever people believe to be true will be true in its consequences, we can appreciate why it's important to build, to do research that builds understandings of how young kids come to view their local communities as places to stay forever or as places to leave as soon as possible, in addition to the research that tallies local opportunities, demographics, well-being measures, job vacancies, and so on. One final thing to note is that when young people say that they want employment, what they mean is not just a job, but a career, a good job. The studies we can synthesize tell us that rural young people, like most, are looking for some stability in terms of their finances and their identities, and they see the establishment of a career as a step toward full adulthood and citizenship. So targeting young people's opinions about careers is only half of the battle. It's also making sure that the employment opportunities at home are actually stable, long-term, and jobs with potential for upward mobility. This matters especially when you place youth outmigration in historical and political economic context. So we are in an era in which short-term jobs with limited career mobility are proliferating. Here again, researchers have found that the rise of precarious work or the fragmentation of careers are exaggerated in our perception. So in other words, the perception of growing insecurity might be worse than the reality. But returning to that Thomas theorem again, people are adjusting their behaviors and they're interpreting their own experiences at work through the lens of their perception. And so they're increasingly anxious about career, they're cognizant of risk and risk management, and they're approaching decisions about career and education like gamblers. And of course, it's not all in our heads. Union membership is declining and precarious forms of work are spreading, such as the jobs characteristic of the so-called gig economy. And I'm going to return to that point later. The third overarching finding concerns the impact of social inequalities on young people's pathways. There are patterns to who leaves and who stays. Some people grow up never having the option to leave. It's not a choice to stay, but a foregone conclusion. People who lack the economic means to go to university far away, or who have to drop out of high school to care for aging relatives or to help run a family business. People who themselves have a disability or another barrier to labor market participation. People who've never considered moving to be an option simply because nobody in their family has left the community. Across the studies that we analyzed, gender, class, and sexuality have been found to predict to a significant degree who leaves and who stays. So we came to really emphasize that supports to stay and supports to leave, that's someone else's terminology, not ours, but that we need to have both supports to stay and supports to leave, and that these can aspire to a very hands-off, laissez-faire version of equality of opportunity, but policymakers and community actors have to think through what that looks like. Who can realistically leave or stay? Who can realistically access supports to do either? A final set of findings suggests to us that rural youth outmigration is only a problem if our main goal is keeping a community's population at a certain level. Because young people who leave do accrue certain benefits, this hurts me as a Nova Scotian to acknowledge this, but people who leave earn more money. They are able to get the kind of education that they need to succeed in the career that they want to. They gain experiences, they benefit from their mobility. And so the idea of interfering in that becomes problematic. If we care about young people's interests, we won't attempt to hold them in place for the good of their communities alone. So we highlighted this very compelling point from the literature as it was supported by the majority of studies that we looked at, whether the authors arrived at that conclusion or not. And we argued that policy needs to develop along those two lines, supports to leave and supports to stay. So instead of incentives or interventions, we need to think about how to ensure that young people can make informed, supported, realistic choices about where they live, whether they stay or go or come back. Now I'm going to hand it over to Hannah to talk about some of the other findings around what attracts people to rural communities and what pushes them away.
Thank you. So I'm just going to go into a little more detail about our findings, starting with the reasons that young people either stay, return to, or come to a rural community. Across the literature, we saw that people who have higher levels of attachment to place and strong social ties are less likely to leave and more likely to return after getting education elsewhere, for example. Attachment to place is more than just an attachment to the physical landscape of a place, but it also has to do with a sense of home and a sense of community, level of social support, and relationships with family and friends in that certain community. Also, the research shows that youth are more likely to feel an attachment to place if they're included in the local decision making and if they just feel respected by adults in their community because of that. And then young people are also attracted to the unique lifestyle of rural communities that may have amenities that urban areas don't always have. They may desire simpler lives, closer to nature. I believe that rural areas can offer this type of lifestyle. I like mountain biking and rock climbing, and it's really hard to do that in the middle of the city sometimes. So when it comes time to have children, many people either stay in rural communities or return to start their family because of this perception sometimes that rural areas are safe or a good place to raise a family. And for some rural communities, they may be close enough to an urban center that is an attraction of them. Because isolation, on the other hand, is a predictor of outmigration. So sort of when you're so isolated from an urban center, people are more likely to move away, but the reverse is true. So a community within commuting distance, for example, of a larger center is more attractive to people than an isolated community, which makes sense. And in studies asking why young people lived in rural communities, lower housing costs was definitely seen as a benefit of living in these communities. But this low cost of living, it is a benefit, but it also may limit some youth's choices, because for low-income youth, staying with parents or in a lower cost living situation in a rural community may be their only choice, even if they did want to go elsewhere for education or work. And well, economic reasons, as Karen's mentioned, are not necessarily the primary reason attracting people to rural communities. They're still important. And not income per se, because there often may be a lower cost of living in some rural areas. But these good jobs, these good careers, maybe we'll talk about that later. But we've learned that people look to the future when they're thinking about where they want to stay and where they want to live and what kind of job they want. They want to look down the line and see that there's going to be a job for them, not just today, but in the future and years down the line, and opportunities for advancement. And so this is where hope comes in as a point. For some, hope for a good future in rural communities may keep them there, and maybe just a tie keeping them there. But for others, a lack of hope or a fatalistic attitude may keep people in these rural communities just feeling like this is the only possible choice, I'm never going to get out of here. So for some, the decision to migrate or not to migrate, it's not really a choice. As Michael Corbett's excellent work on Do We Next shows, some young people are just not afforded the luxury of leaving their community. For these young people, the rational economic choice is to forgo higher education and an uncertain future elsewhere in favor of a certain future, something they know in their home community. And they may be from families who just can't afford to make mistakes during that identity formation time of emerging adulthood. Migration is a risk. Mobility is a risk, and not everyone has the resources always to take the risk of choosing where to go. And so you can retain rural youth in that sense, but they're not always better off from it. And in terms of what motivates young people to leave or just not come to rural communities, which is the next slide. There is an idea that to stay rural is to fail. So narratives of success often include leaving the community. Return migration, so coming back after being away, may be seen as a failure to make it in a bigger or another community. One writer said, rural youth can choose to stay. They're likely to believe, with most of the world, that the choice is a mark of their failure. They can choose to move, but long with most of their mobile rural friends, for home. Like all humans, rural youth try to be savvy about choosing between two evils. For only a few, it is likely to be a very happy choice. And this is kind of why we use this term going with the flow. Because for today's young people, migration is a normal part of the life course. Young people have an imperative to create an identity, and culturally, this involves mobility. This pattern is even more common in families who are highly mobile, as we've heard. So if your parents have moved frequently, then it's not going to seem too weird for you to also move. Mobility begets mobility. The migration patterns of some may normalize these patterns in the future. And so we talked about isolation a little bit before, and certainly a sense of isolation is one reason for young people to leave rural communities. Not only an isolated geographical location, which can certainly be tough, but also isolation within the community. The characteristics of a place that may seem positive in some situations, like the security and strong social ties in rural areas, can also seem very restricting at times. The idea of everybody knowing everybody is liberating to some, and sometimes, and restrictive at other times. Also, youth can feel excluded from adult spaces and pastimes, like pubs or the Legion or something. And they can feel excluded from the governance of the community. Marginalized youth who are already marginalized in society, like LGBTQ youth, can feel even more isolated in rural communities. Youth can also feel bored. When I was in high school, a common refrain was, "There's nothing to do here." They clearly never saw the title bore, I guess. What this means is that certain consumer goods and experiences are just not available in many rural communities. And in our culture, a life full of consumer choice is kind of the expectation. Young people may leave rural communities because they're just interested in new and varied experiences. And there may be plenty to do in a rural community, but there may not be plenty to do that's not sort of under the watchful eyes of parents and the older community members. There may be a lack of a safe third space for gathering, like the coffee shops and the types of things we see pretty plentifully in urban areas. And aspirations for education that is not available in the home community is another reason why young people may leave. So you're successful in secondary school and you look elsewhere for education, it makes sense. And often this education is just outside the community. There just may not be access in the rural community. And then, so you go to university, and then once you receive this degree or this diploma, you may move again in search of employment that matches this education. On the other hand, research does show that some youth will accept a job for which they're overqualified just to live in the community where they want to live. And in terms of lack of services and amenities, this may be a problem, especially with that idea of boredom and there's nothing to do here. It may also be a problem in terms of institutions, community institutions being shut down, like schools in rural communities, because when a school shuts down, it's not simply education service being shut down. It's also a meeting place and a community center leaving the community. So when institutions like this may leave, this means that there's a loss of social ties, or at least a forum where you can make social ties. It may damage the social capital in the community, and this can certainly have an impact on migration decisions. And in the same way that strong social ties can definitely keep people in rural communities, bad social ties can make people want to escape these rural communities. And again, if your spouse is from somewhere else, then you may have a really good reason to go somewhere else as well. And the next point on the next slide is just a short note on the contradictory feelings that we all feel about our communities. Rural youth holds ambivalent, contradictory feelings about their communities, both loving and hating them, often at the same time. They may form their identity as being rural as opposed to urban, but they're also always aware of this darker side of rural life, and they may hate a community and always complain about it, but really miss it when they leave. And migration is rarely a one-time, discrete, linear event. Its motivations form and reform throughout childhood and young adulthood, and throughout the rest of the life course, and actual trajectories are complex and even cyclical. Young people may think of migration away from their community as an opportunity, a stepping stone for their goals, but others may think of it as an exile, as someone forced away from a community where they could never truly find a place. And at the same time, Outmigration today looks a lot different than it may have in previous generations, because we have such leaps in technological advances like communications technology and air travel and so on, which makes it really easy to maintain ties with your home community even when you're living really far away. So you can maintain that rural identity while living in a place that meets your needs in a way that the rural community just may not be able to do at that time. And do you want to take it from here again? Thanks.
So in the months, we're on the next slide now. In the months after releasing the, and one more slide. In the months after releasing this report, and before this conference, I've been thinking a lot about how youth outmigration fits into some of the other pressing political economic issues that are facing rural communities and affecting all of us, really. And so I think what I'm going to do and make this decision on the fly is that we have some policy recommendations at the end of the report, and I invite people to consult the report and read those. They're the ones that we felt stemmed most from the data. But I'm going to spend the rest of my minutes up here to talk about avenues for future research and other questions that are unaddressed or insufficiently addressed in the research that affect what we do in rural communities as policymakers and people who want to change things. So the first big contextual issue is the rise of the gig economy, which I mentioned already, and I've been thinking a lot about this as I listen to other presentations and other panels. It's a growing sector. It encompasses companies that connect service providers directly to consumers. So think about Uber, Airbnb, TaskRabbit, and the like. So these platform companies make a profit off of the labor of workers and the labor that's purchased by the customer, but they flout employment legislation. They avoid Merck's benefits and safety regulations by claiming that they are merely technologies that connect a service provider with a consumer or an employee. They also say that they're not employers. While Uber might seem like something that's irrelevant for rural communities, it is just the tip of the gig economy iceberg. The model that they follow of allowing workers to sign up and operate almost anywhere remotely has obvious implications for rural areas. Airbnb, while it's more about connecting underutilized assets to customers, is having a huge impact on rural communities where property owners can make more money on short-term rentals to vacationers than long-term rental housing. So the market for the latter is tightening up. There's a comment in the last panel about the availability of affordable rental options in rural communities. And I think that's a piece of it, is the Airbnb phenomenon. It certainly is in rural communities in Nova Scotia. But Airbnb is also opening up income streams for people who want to live rurally but don't have sufficient employment income. So a person could buy a large house at rural prices and they could renovate it, rent part of it out to supplement their mortgage. Like lots of possible policies, Airbnb is enabling some people to move in or stay while it pushes other people out. And these things affect young people and youth outmigration. Looking at other kinds of gigging that may involve a more straightforward exchange of labor for a wage, we can speculate about rural impacts, particularly for young people with marketable skills in tech, design, writing, and other kinds of work where you can do the work anywhere with little equipment. So there are apps that allow people to work for multiple employers as much or as little as they want from wherever they want, and people are doing it. Again, while the work is certainly plagued by insecurity, a lack of legal protections, instability, potentially low pay and no benefits, the work is also extremely flexible. There's lots of it available and there's very little overhead. So this means that local job opportunities are not the be-all and end-all when it comes to youth out-migration. Instead, other things become more important: social spaces, amenities, demographics, and so on. So there are pilot projects in some rural communities that offer free startup space to people who are in tech jobs, because it's not so much about providing the job as it is about providing the space and the ability to do something remotely from anywhere. But on the other hand, I could flip back and forth endlessly, so you're lucky that we have time constraints here. See here. The problem with gig companies is that they are still capitalistic entities, and they are set on profit making. And if history shows us anything, it's that workers without unions and protective legislation generally only fare well in the boom times. So relying on something like the gig economy to open up rural opportunities is not really reliable unless there are the proper protocols in place. A second focus that begs for our attention in this area is climate change. So all over, we're being pressed to consider drastic changes in how we live our lives and how we run our organizations, less air travel, more telecommuting, and so on. This is a crisis, but it's also an opportunity to apply changes in rural and remote areas that these areas would have benefited from a long time ago, and in many cases have been asking for, so better broadband and that sort of thing. It might seem disconnected from the issue of rural out-migration, but it's absolutely, it absolutely circumscribes any discussion of the future. It has to. So I think there's great potential and great need for researchers who are working on rural climate change and researchers working on youth out-migration to put their heads together. The third contextual piece that I think has only been minimally incorporated into youth out-migration research is the dominance of neoliberal social and economic policy. Most scholars understand that this is the backdrop, particularly in youth studies. It's widely accepted that today's young people are living more individualized lives, that they're increasingly compelled to think of themselves as entrepreneurs, and that they have a brand that they have to market and that kind of thing. And that they have to start using economic frames to understand the non-economic realms of their lives. All sorts of relationships are arguably becoming more contractualized. That's what this research tells us. But there's a tension that arises in my own research in rural communities, which complicates how we have to confront and make sense of neoliberalism. And specifically, I hear about communities that are asking for more control. They want more self-determination. I hear communities proclaiming that they cannot and should not wait for government to save them because it never worked in the long run, because it seems impossible in today's climate of austerity, and also because they've seen too many government solutions that are developed in distant cities and that are out of touch with and out of scale with local contexts. As an observer in those discussions, I can't help but be persuaded that communities do need more control over the policies that affect them, and the infrastructure and amenities that serve them. But at the same time, I'm aware of the fact that much of the plea for self-determination is a consequence of people internalizing the austerity logic about personal responsibility, that governments can't afford to do things. This is problematic because there are some things that communities can't do with regards to rural youth out-migration and other things. And I hesitate to further the idea that government support is something to be ashamed of rather than an essential pillar of having a functional society. So policies in any area have to walk this fine line between self-determination for rural communities and unrealistic responsibilization. So they need, as one of my colleagues put it, to ensure that responsibilities are not downloaded without the necessary resources. So I just have one more slide. Shifting back from those contextual bits and thoughts about future research, I want to revisit the point that we made at the outset, that rural youth out-migration is not one monolithic problem, but rather it's at least 3 interrelated problems or priorities, areas that beg for political and institutional support. We are not, or we can't be concerned only with young people who leave. In fact, young people who want to leave and do are not really a problem. That problem is actually better restated as a problem for the community left behind. A community with unmet needs, needs that theoretically could have been met if young out-migrants had stayed. Once we restate the problem as a community problem and not a youth problem, we have two remaining problems for young people themselves. The first is the problem of young people who want to stay in a rural community and can't, either because there are no viable livelihoods or they're unknown for social reasons. The second is the problem of young people who want to pursue opportunities outside the community but can't because they don't have the capital, economic, educational, social, cultural, or otherwise. So I made this diagram because I wanted to illustrate that there are areas where policy could address two or even three of the problems at once. And I wanted to have this in your minds as we move into Ray's presentation on the numbers and the demand for these kinds of solutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen and Hannah, for the invitation to join this panel. I was listening to Karen and Hannah. It was reminding me of the life story of my former youth. I grew up in a farm in Manitoba, went to a one-room school, and then after I got to high school, a school bus came and took me to high school in a town 12 miles away. And my father really could not understand why I did not want to keep going to the dances at the rural school, the one-room school, why I wanted to go to the dance at the high school. And of course, being a polite young fellow, I decided not to remind him. We were living in Manitoba. I did not remind him he met my mother at a dance in New Westminster. So I thought there was a bit of inconsistency there in his observations. Let me push the button to go forward again. There we are. So the talk is Whither Rural Youth, and looking at the geographic demand, the demographic demand for the supports to leave, supports to return, supports to stay that Karen and Hannah were talking about. So I have an outline, and the introduction is simply, I think the point has been made, rural youth out-migration remains a policy issue, at least among many, and Karen and Hannah might say that's a misplaced policy issue, but that's the best way to get to the top of the headlines in the local newspaper. Rural out-migration is a problem, even if it's a misplaced problem. As a background, as Hannah and Karen had said, rural youth retention is often the policy focus, but in their report, they argue rural youth out-migration is not the problem for policy intervention. Rather, policy should focus on supports to leave, supports to stay, and perhaps supports to return. So one objective would be to create sustaining communities with characteristics that make the rural lifestyle attractive and will attract returning migrants and new in-migrants, and be respectful of the young people who decide to stay and call the place their home, or stay at home and call it home. And as a background, I've been doing some fact sheets with the Rural Ontario Institute, and Diane has agreed to pass around the complete list of fact sheets that have been there. And she also has a few extra copies of various things, so an example of various fact sheets. And there are more total list out at the table. But between Norma Getley at the Rural Ontario Institute and I have been interested in these migration issues. So there's a list of titles specifically on migration. My objective, following up on the talk of Karen and Hannah, is to quantify the size of the target clientele. If we are to have a policy attention on youth that leave, youth that stay, youth that return, how many people are we talking about? What's the size of those policies that we might be talking about? Now, to do all this, I have to define a rural and urban grid, and every time I give a talk, of course, there's a different grid. So at the various top here, the geographic grid for this presentation and what I've been doing with the Rural Ontario Institute, 3 types of census divisions: metro census divisions, partly non-metro census divisions, non-metro census divisions defined in the fine print there where you can find them. So a census division is, in some provinces, a county. In Quebec, it's an MRC. In BC, it's a regional district. In Saskatchewan, it is lines on a map that goes around a bunch of municipalities. And what is a census metropolitan area? That's a functional city. So here we are in Saskatoon with 222,000, but people commute into Saskatoon from Corman Park, where there's 8,000, and Warman, where there's 7,000, and Martinsville with 8,000. But little towns, Colonsay with 500, Allen with 600, but not Zelma. I'm not sure why Zelma's not in, but Allen is in. And all those communities are part of the Saskatoon Census Metropolitan Area because they commute in and they're part of a functional economic area. So, back to what did I do? Well, a lot of the lines on the map for census divisions go through a CMA. So if I have a line on the map for census divisions and there's only a CMA in it, that's called a metro census division. There will be some census divisions, some of these lines on the map, where some municipalities inside are in the CMA and some are outside the CMA, so that would be a partially non-metro census division or a metro adjacent census division, if you will. And there are many census divisions with no community being attached to a CMA, and that would be a non-metro census division. And if you're clear on that, you've obviously read it before, because it's hard to explain just by waving my hands. So bear with me, we'll give it a run here. And I have another slide. Can you push the slide back to the back? I think it's time to go to, I don't remember the order of my slides here, but I think the one next to it might actually be some numbers with a chart. And so the numbers going up, you're trying to find the next slide? So we're making progress towards the slide at the back. So each year there's a bar going up, and that's how many young people moved into a census division in non-metro Canada. And then there are bars going down each year. That's how many people moved out of a census division each year. I'm looking at folks 18 to 24. So each year, how many people moved out, how many people moved in, then there's a black bar. If the up is bigger than the down, there's positive net in migration. And if the black is down, there's negative in migration, or there's more people moving out than moving in. And if I remember the numbers without looking here, in the most recent year, there were 48,000 youth, 18 to 24, that moved into a non-metro census division. Well, they might have moved from another non-metro census division. They could have moved from Fort St. John to Prince George, or they could have moved from one county in rural Nova Scotia to another county, going to Antigonish or Acadia. Those are non-metro census divisions. So the size of the target clientele would be 48,000 in the most recent year for the people who moved in. Right, 48,000 people moving in, because 60,000 moved out. And there's the demand for the supports to leave. So if I got the difference there, it's about 12,000 that left on a net basis. And those numbers are fairly stable over time. And there's a chart that will be available for those who want to apply for it that says those things are fairly stable over time. In percentage terms, I forget the percentage terms because they're on the chart, but the percentage terms are in the order of 6% move in, 8% move out. There's a loss of about 2% a year. 6% moving in, 8% moving out. That's a churn of 14%. 100 minus 14 is a number like 86 or so. Every year, 86% of the youth stay. So the 86% stay, there is the demand for services for stayers, 14% moving in and out. So if you're in a non-metro census division, you meet a young person, 18 to 24, 1 in 7 would have just left, just moved in, but 86% were stayers in the last year. So there's the size of the demand. Now, I have a map, and it shows where the big places and small places are for net in-migration, net out-migration. So the biggest net out-migration is in northeast of British Columbia. Is it Stikeen or Stickeenville? Stickeen. And second biggest out-migration is in Gloucester, Cumberland. In Nova Scotia, Cumberland County? Okay, Cumberland County, I think it's Cumberland County, in the northeast part of Nova Scotia. And then the third biggest one is Victoria County, which is in Cape Breton on the east side of the Cabot Trail. So it's back. So let us back up a bit, because I jumped to the results. Let me back. So why youth leave and return? I went straight to the results that I remembered, and so we'll get to those. Why do youth leave and return? And this is an old chart, but it makes sense to me, except for the fact that this was done, I think, before the internet. So I hid in, tried to not show my gray hair in the youth table there a while ago. And why did youth want to move to someplace? Number one, high speed. Number two, a vibrant cultural scene that would cause people to move in. And internet was not an issue, and this was done. But I like this chart because it says, you ask youth, why did they leave back then? Number one, jobs. Number two, education. Number three, fun. And then you ask youth, at the bottom, a set of youth identifying reasons why you would choose to live in a rural community, not jobs. Family and community. Number one, less crime, security, safety. Number two, family-based. Number three, simpler lifestyle. Number four, community. Number five, good place to live, cleaner environment. Jobs is down there at the bottom. Have a job related to rural life. So there's a difference what people say cause them to leave the jobs, but it's not jobs that says that they'll come back. And I think that's consistent with what we're saying in more modern studies. And what could municipalities do to encourage people to come back? Well, okay, more jobs, but more fun, entertainment, social events, vibrant cultural scene, and recreation, and so on. The next point of context is that the changing demographic pressure of the labor force, and the blue line is at the very beginning of 250, way back in the 1970s. Every time 100 people retired, 250 people were coming on the labor market. And then in about 2009, every time a person retired, one person was coming on the labor market. Now we're at 2017, 2018, every time 100 people retire, only 80 people are coming on the labor market. Across, this is Canada, across Canada, there's a labor shortage in the calculation of age of people retiring versus age of people entering the labor market. Now, the workforces keep going up because old people like Bill and I keep on working for some reason. And if we stop working, and then this would have a real impact on the labor market. Here's the line for non-metro versus metro. So the red line is non-metro, so it's lower. So therefore, fewer people coming on the labor market versus retiring people in non-metro versus metro. So job shortages are a bigger issue in non-metro. The next thing on context is the population in non-metro CDs is not declining, growing very slowly. So the black line with white dots, the white circles, says from 96, 8.6 million to 2017, 9.1 million. Very slow growth, but not declining. So rural Canada, non-metro Canada is not declining. It's just growing more slowly than urban. And that's the case no matter what definition of rural you might choose. Youth mobility. So here's the line up. The line up is 48,000. That's the number of people who moved in the most recent period, 18 to 24. The line down, so I think that might be one estimate of the demand for support to return or the demand for support for migrants in that 1 year. And here is the 60,000, 61,000 out migrants. I'm saying that might be the demand for the support to leave. And obviously part of the demand for support to leave is, can you go and get a job for which there's a requirement back in this community? You're talking about young people don't know the jobs are in your community. How many people actually have a bachelor's of commerce working in the hardware store or the lumber store or whatever? Not many kids in grade 9, 10, 11, 12 do not know that. And that's very important for local communities to talk to the young folks in high school, in my opinion. So the black line is there's always more people moving out than moving in this age group. And then the percents are, if I remember correctly, yes, 6% were moving out, 8% were moving, 6% moving in, that's positive, 8% moving out, that's negative. So a net migration of about -2%. And those numbers have been fairly consistent, a bit higher back before 2005. So on the green bar there, we've ranked census divisions. So go down to the bottom, might be able to see it from the back. Non-metro census divisions ranked by their net migrants per year. So the Stickeen Census Division lost 14.3% of their youth on average per year over the last 5 years. And at the very bottom, you can see Alberta Census Division 15, Canmore, gained on the green bar about 5.6% of their youth on a net basis over the last 5 years. So, and you've got the other ones there. So I think you know where these places are, but I do have a map. So we go to the next one, which is a map. And it'll show you that Stickeen is this place in northern British Columbia, the highest net out-migration of youth. Guysborough was not Cumberland. Guysborough is the second biggest out-migration of youth in Canada and Victoria County. And then the biggest net in-migration is Canmore, which is Calgary, just before you get to Banff. And soon those will be revised in about February of 2019, and we'll see if it stays high or they come back at a different level, because they have to implement an intercensus revision between 2011 and 2016. But, so, they're approximately correct, but all of these are subject to revision when you get the final census numbers. So, I'll finish this up here. Rural youth out-migration remains a policy issue. Youth out-migration is not the problem for policy, therefore we need supports to leave, supports to stay. The objective was to try to quantify these different sizes of flows and the objectives for policy. Geographic grid, I concentrated on, right, the last one should be non-metro CDs. And the results are, why do youth leave and return? Leave for jobs, schooling and fun, return for family and community. Changing context, new demographic pressure of the labor market, more people retiring than coming in, potentially job shortages. Total population, non-metro CDs has grown very slightly, but has grown over 2 decades. And on youth mobility, I'm saying 48K move in per year, about 6%. That's the demand for support to return. 61K move out, and 8% demand for support to leave. And the turnover is anywhere to 14%, 1 in 7 move each year. 6 and 7 stay in a given year, the demand for support to stay. So, time to sunset this. Thank you very much.
Thank everyone for coming to this panel, and hope to see many of you at the social mixer thing later on. And if anyone's interested in following up on the research, I think you can find any of us in the conference app or on the website. Thank you very much.